So let's talk about the window of tolerance, the window of flexibility, if you will, in healing from narcissistic abuse. To understand what happens to you in a narcissistic relationship, you have to understand fundamentals of trauma. A narcissistic relationship represents a chronic state of threat and a loss of safety from someone who's meant to be an attachment object of some kind, right? And because it's so unrelenting, and it can happen over multiple relationships. For example, you might have had a narcissistic parent in childhood, a narcissistic intimate relationship, etc. The repeated exposures can result in a sort of traumatic conditioning in which your sympathetic nervous system is often on alert. Remember, we are attachment-seeking creatures. Now, Dr. Dan Siegel uses this term window of tolerance. Other folks I have talked to call it a window of flexibility, but to describe a sort of optimally aroused space where we're flexible and we're resilient, we can handle stress. That's the window. Now, trauma responses can either leave people either over or hyper aroused, and during those hyper-aroused times, you may experience intense anxiety, a sense of being overwhelmed or feeling out of control with your emotions, perhaps feeling emotionally dysregulated or angry. These are sympathetic responses to an interpersonal trigger or an internal sensation. And when you feel like this, you are unsettled. You're not able to concentrate or focused or are distressed by your emotional state. Or you may even behave in a manner that later on brings up negative emotions such as shame. Again, this hyper-aroused state is out of that window of tolerance. You can think of it as sort of above the open window. Like all trauma responses, this over or hyper-aroused state isn't voluntary. You're not doing this on purpose. It's sort of a fear-aroused response. And when you are feeling like this, you are not thinking about things like radical acceptance and individuation and all the higher order topics related to healing. You feel overwhelmed and awful. Okay, so there's the window, and that's above the window, right? Out of the window. Okay, now under the window. Okay, so now we're still outside the window, but now we're under it. Is what we might call the under aroused or sort of hypo arousal. Lower arousal. These times you are sort of clicked out, mildly dissociated, numb. We may see the freeze response here, but you are sort of out of it. And again, after times that you're in this hypo-aroused state, this low arousal state, you may also feel a sense of shame for not advocating for yourself or saying something or being so numbed out that you weren't present. This is not voluntary. You are not doing this on purpose. It is a reflexive response to trauma and fear and is protective, as all sympathetic responses are meant to be. Now, once again, this is not a time when you're in this state where someone teaching you about grief and realistic expectations and all of the educational stuff about narcissistic relationship is going to get through. When a person is going through trauma and working it through, sometimes this window is really small and these two states are what occupy. Now, what's between the two? That's the window of tolerance, of flexibility, where you are alert, well-regulated, present, and in a space where you can take in difficult topics like radical acceptance and learn ways of coping with or disengaging from the narcissistic relationship and be able to feel and hear that you are not to blame for what is happening in this relationship. The bigger this window, the better it is, okay? Now, the more recent the betrayal trauma or the other harms, not just from the narcissistic relationship, but also other traumas, and the less you have been able to address those traumas and those trauma responses or get therapy, the smaller this window is. And there may be an alternating between the hyper and the hypo, or the high and the low aroused states, going between overwhelming emotion to numbness and dissociation. The smaller the window, the more you are in a state of sympathetic nervous system response, which leaves you exhausted and not present in your life. It can also mean that learning how these narcissistic patterns are unfolding in the relationship can be difficult to take in, and that goals like individuation, autonomy, and authenticity seem impossibly far off. Survivors of narcissistic relationships are either over or under regulated, and this is often in lockstep with the high and low arousal states we see flanking the window of tolerance. To any therapist who may be watching this video, you want to work with your client, obviously, to get that window space wider, to open up opportunities for your client to be able to engage in being educated and practicing coping and disengagement and breaking out of cycles of self-blame. For those of you who are watching this and you're in one of these relationships, you want to get into that window of flexibility, that window of tolerance. And again, to the therapist, it's a reminder that all clinical work that we do with clients who are experiencing narcissistic relationship is always and foremost trauma and antagonism informed work. But understanding the window of tolerance can help you become more self-compassionate in the face of your own healing. Because what may happen is that you feel as though everyone else seems to be getting it and healing and moving forward and radically accepting and grieving and getting social support. And you can't break out of this overwhelming sense of awful and despair and even times of just sort of being numb and dissociated. In your case, that backing and forthing, it may be that that window is too small. And the work then for you is first to focus on the trauma-oriented work, whether that is EMDR or somatic therapies or IFS or EFT or whatever is working for you, to work through your trauma responses, to get into the present moment, to feel in your body and feel grounded. That is what has to happen before you can start getting into the minutia of decision making and all the rest of it. It's easy to forget that narcissistic abuse and the fallout of narcissistic relationships is on a continuum. Some folks in narcissistic relationships are enduring physical abuse, financial abuse, isolation, and may also have trauma histories separate from the narcissistic relationship. Folks going through more severe narcissistic abuse may compare themselves to those who are going through milder or moderate narcissistic abuse. Still awful, but for whom the window of tolerance and flexibility may be wider. And so you are grasping that they aren't going to change stuff if you're in that wider window, and addressing the self-blame more headlong. And I often observe that folks who are going through more narcissistic abuse or who have partners whose behaviors are more consistent with psychopathy or malignant dark tetrad kind of stuff will often think, maybe it's me that is a mess because I am just all over the place and I'm so overwhelmed that I can't come down. And it's not you. It's the shades of gray of trauma recovery and understanding that we need to get that window wider for you so you feel more regulated and able to do the more cognitive work of healing. And the window reminds us that even as you heal, and even after months or even years, and you are faced with a reminder of your narcissistic relationship, that you can get into that hyper or under aroused state and find yourself overwhelmed or numb and mildly dissociated and feel like everything you learned just went out the window. Pun intended. It didn't. It's about taking what you have learned about breathing and mindfulness and soothing and connecting to your body and feeling safe to get back into that window, that flexibility, that tolerance, and recognizing that you were triggered and your body was simply trying to keep you safe. You may even find that when you are in the more hyper-aroused state, that the language you use to talk about yourself is awful. I am a stupid, awful, loser, terrible person. I deserve this. And again, as you come back into yourself, You recognize that the persecutory language is that protective part that tries to keep you from the edge in that awful way, in that awful voice. We can learn new ways, but you need to be more in that top, flexible, tolerant space to get there. As you heal, that window gets bigger, and you also learn how to use your body, your words, your breath, your awareness, your thoughts to care for yourself. You are better able to manage stress and the crises of life. It doesn't mean the narcissistic relationship doesn't hurt, or the narcissistic words don't aggravate and befuddle you. But you may feel better able to manage the stress that they raise. Understanding this can also help you understand how to best approach your healing, especially if you find that overwhelm or numbing or tuning out are frequent go-tos. It means working on that part first and then turning into the more educational, tactical stuff. While all narcissistic folks have a lot in common, all of our relationships and histories are different, and our healing processes will be as well. Thanks again.